Why did guerrilla groups rise up in Mexico during the Dirty War? And how did things escalate as a result of this into pitched gun battles and government counterinsurgency and state terror tactics? What would drive a peasant or ordinary person to join one of these leftist guerrilla groups? And to what extent did they represent the larger Mexican peasant and working class population as a whole? Although it is true that these are difficult questions to answer, sometimes the answers to questions of war and violence and dissatisfaction are not as grand and conspiratorial as you might think. Sometimes the answer to human motivations lies in historical memory and the ordinariness of the mundane. As we discussed in the last episode, a big theme of Mexican history is land reform and local democracy. These are the key issues accelerating the Mexican Revolution of 1910, key promises in the Constitution of 1917, and key failures in the policy of the PRI after the revolution and into the 21st century. Land and economics are key factors that drive peasant behavior in Mexico. From a big picture perspective, as we talked about a little bit in the last episode, Mexico in the 20th century is modernizing. From an economic perspective, large-scale corporate private agriculture is increasingly the name of the game from the 1900s up to 2000 as the PRI seeks to insert Mexico into a larger global economy. The state during this time makes an effort to ensure that private interests are greased in order to export and distribute to large-scale foreign markets in an increasingly capitalist world. In many cases, this leaves peasant communities in the lurch as they slowly see their land being swallowed up by big farms and landholding interests. Now, for a long time in Mexico, there is something called the ejido system, which was an attempt to distribute or uphold communal land rights for peasants and campesinos, but these ejidos had mixed legacies. Some felt they didn't go far enough in redistributing land from these large landholding interests. Others felt that it was only a stopgap solution and didn't really address the larger economic trends of modernization. Historian Elizabeth Henson describes this tension between the ejido system and the economic trend that Mexico seemed to be on and really moving towards since about the mid-1800s. Henson says, quote, "The struggle for land has animated generations of revolutionaries, but the small farming unit, whether cooperative or not, rarely provides a dignified living. The failure of the ejido system was obvious long before the dissolution of Article 27 of the Constitution, which promised land to the landless in the early 1900s, and cannot be blamed only on greed and corruption. The ejidos assumed an impossible burden to provide social justice and a livelihood to their members, to feed the growing cities in their march to industrialization, and to provide the state with a mechanism for the political incorporation of peasant campesinos. Their creation did not take into account demographic pressure on lands that were frequently marginal to begin with. Economic conditions in the country as a whole and beyond its borders favor large agricultural extensions geared to foreign markets. The corn and beans subsistence farm in the long run produces only migrant workers. The small plot at best is part of a mixed strategy for family survival. Illegally rented out or marginally farmed and combined with wage labor, migration, handicrafts, and small-scale retail sales, it provides an additional source of income or food. The miseries of wage labor must have been a powerful incentive to demand increased land. Working conditions in the expanded lumber industry were grim. Accident rates were high in both the Monte and the sawmills. In the Monte, the workers camped out for weeks in danger from animals, falling trees, and other injuries. In town, the work was more secure, although poorly paid and dangerous as well. Conditions in mining were even more perilous, tightly controlled and isolated. The majority of migrant workers remained caught in a cycle of seasonal migration, with low wages, family separation, and periodic deportation, unable to get ahead. The destruction of the latifundio laid the basis for modern Mexico, as it freed capital to flow into industry. But changes in land ownership have not brought substantial improvements in the lives of campesinos. The ejidos and small landowners have been isolated as large-scale entrepreneurial agriculture has expanded and captured more of the market. The largest ejido in the Republic, El Largo, in the Madera district, derives little benefit from its forest. Profits go to the companies which control its processing and distribution. End quote. Now, that's a bit of a complex bit of modern history there, but you begin to understand the economic misery that many in Mexico were feeling at the time. Conditions were tough for the working class and the lower class in many industries. There was a desire for land as a way to make a living, but also as a means of seeking justice for wrongs that date back decades and maybe even centuries. And for many in this peasant class, it seemed like the deck was stacked against them. Historian Elizabeth Henson further argues that the economic issues that peasants and working class people faced in the mid-1900s were mirrored by the issues of lower class people generations before them. Here, Henson is talking about rural peasant communities that are being attempted to be forced by Spanish Jesuit groups into villages to be more economically productive. And this is happening in an area called the Sierra Madre Occidental, which is very close to the area that we were talking about in the previous quote. She says, quote, "There, the indigenous people revolted 5 times during the 17th century against Jesuit attempts to concentrate them in villages. Abandoned with the Jesuit expulsion in 1767, they fled to the Sierra and took up nomadic herding, preferring their isolated rancherias until the mid-20th century." End quote. So you have the ghosts of economic and social wrongs of the past being felt by people from the same area generations later, even into the mid-1900s. When large landholding interests are swallowing up ejidos or other peasant land, people are being hurt by that. But they are also adding it to the list of injustices that modernization has been piling high in Mexico for centuries. As Henson argues in that quote, peasant land had been enclosed. Railroads to industrialize and modernize are being built right through peasant land and communities. The state attempts to control and manage the land of the frontier only after encouraging campesinos to settle and tone it down first. And you start beginning to see these large-scale issues of land reform that are going to be a central cause of guerrilla communities forming and thus leading into the Dirty War. Historian Alan Gomez describes this land reform issue pretty well, I think. He says, quote, "After the end of the Mexican Revolution, President Lázaro Cárdenas made some 20 million hectares of land available to peasant campesinos so that by 1940, more than 50% of Mexico's agricultural production came from communal ejidal lands. After World War II, private interests began a process of re-enclosure that by the 1960s had largely transformed Mexican agriculture into private commercial agriculture. But the bottom line was that need for land outpaced the PRI's political will to redistribute lands. So people took things into their own hands." End quote. So like we've been talking about, this process of private interests and commercial interests in bed with the ruling PRI government are swallowing up peasant lands. And this is happening for a long time in the 20th century, but it really starts heating up in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. So for a historian like Gomez, there is a direct relationship between these economic concerns and the development of guerrilla movements in Mexico that ultimately heat up into the Mexican Dirty War. And I think it's important to note that the economic issues in Mexico that we're describing are contributing to the argument that revolution and war often exist in the mundane, in the ordinary. And that's because the memory of everyday objects, places, names, they may not seem like much at first glance, but they have a deep history of feeling. A railroad isn't just a railroad. It's an example of injustice and state overreach when that railroad is built through a long-standing indigenous community and disrupting their lives. A public square isn't just a pretty landmark. It's symbolic of a time when land and local democracy were more than just political slogans. And increasingly, as guerrilla groups start to form and violence increases, family members, last names, homes, and geographical landscapes take on symbolic meanings as the death radiates out. So there are economic and social issues pushing a segment of people towards violent revolution because they're dissatisfied with being a subsidizer of economic modernization as they see it. But there's also this historical and memory-based causation and reasons that lead people to violence. Historian Romain Robinet describes how, for one communist guerrilla group known as the Liga, participation in a revolutionary movement was an emotional response to deep and historic personal trauma. He says, quote, "Violence was indeed an emotional response to the deep traumatism felt by the guerrillas, most of them, beyond the memory of the massacres of 1968 and 1971, were regularly confronted with the murder of their comrades at the hands of the police or the army. In fact, for these young people, friendships were very strong and strengthened by the activity's clandestine nature and their common political commitment. On both sides, in the Liga and among counter-revolutionary forces, the logics of vengeance can explain the global radicalization of the micro-civil war. From an ideological perspective, the Liga deeply thought that political violence, maybe more than propaganda, would convince the Mexican people of the necessity to achieve a new revolution." End quote. I think this brings us to the next reason that ordinary people may have been compelled to join guerrilla groups, and that reason is simply the brutality of the government response to guerrilla violence. Historian Alexander Avina chronicles some of the excesses of the PRI response to guerrilla warfare. Here, he claims that a left-wing guerrilla organization chronicled all sorts of state terror, and here he's relying on a guerrilla group called the BCA, some of their documentation. He says, quote, "The BCA authors decried the widespread violation of human rights committed by the Mexican army troops sent to Guerrero. Quote, soldiers torture campesinos, asking them about us and the location of narcotics. They steal campesinos' clothes, money, and food, and they forcibly march them to Acapulco. They also burn campesinos' chests with gasoline and brutally beat them." Back to Avina now. DFS documents later backed BCA claims concerning the use of gasoline and torture techniques. Soldiers forced campesinos to drink gasoline and subsequently set them on fire. End quote. Avina is looking at this through guerrilla documents, so you might think this is one-sided, but he's also basing this on a lot of recently declassified Mexican government documents. Once the PRI was voted out of power in the year 2000, a lot of this documentation became available to historians to study. So Avina goes on to say, quote, "Declassified documents also reveal the military's development of a lexicon of terror used to denote the unconstitutional practices of unlawful arrest, torture, and disappearance. Within daily military correspondence, torture became revision or interrogation, and a illegally detained person a package. At times, a long-held archived package possessed a name. The fact that General Hermenegildo Cuenca Diaz, head of the Mexican military as Secretary of Defense, systematically used language by mid-1973 in internal documentation addressed to high-ranking PRI officials suggests that orders for violations of constitutional and human rights came from the very top of the PRI regime. Nearly 600 documented inhabitants, most of them from the Adiac region, remain disappeared. The disappeared most likely experienced torture and execution in the military camps of Acapulco, Paila de Cuesta, Adiac, and Mexico City. Countless others suffered illegal detention and torture. An unknown number of victims suffered death flights. After being thrown off airplanes stationed near the port of Acapulco, they disappeared into the Pacific Ocean. End quote. These death flights are obviously horrifying, but as Avina is saying here, they were just one method of state terror, and thousands of people were tortured, disappeared, or killed, many of them civilians. Now, guerrilla groups across Mexico were no strangers to violence themselves, and they often responded to state terror with violent techniques of their own. Kidnappings of high-profile businessmen, ambushes of military personnel and police, bank robbing, hit-and-run assassinations. These groups were no stranger to violence themselves. Historical memory and the politics of vengeance play a key role here, as once a cycle of violence gets going, it's very hard to get out of it. One guerrilla group we've mentioned before, known as the BCA, officially justified the kidnapping of a high-powered businessman by claiming vengeance for the assassination of Emiliano Zapata, the peasant hero of the Mexican Revolution, who was murdered so many years before. One guerrilla says, quote, "Recall that you organized a worse trick against Emiliano Zapata. You called him to Chinameca, claiming to join this cause, but received him with bullets. The people's hope died there, and that is why today we must wage a socialist revolution. Our path is illuminated by the great examples of Morelos, Francisco Villa, Ricardo Flores Magón, and Emiliano Zapata." End quote. Another example here of the role that historical memory in the actions of real people during the Mexican Dirty War had. Again, these are not just economic and social issues in the present, but they are the compilation and the end result of historical memory that is going back decades or even centuries. And that is making them all the more powerful. I think it's worth taking a aside here, because there is a bit of a heated chicken or egg style debate as to who is most responsible for the Dirty War. Did these leftist guerrilla movements usurp traditional democratic means and initiate violence which forced the government to respond violently themselves? Or did PRI violence and fraud and state terror contribute more to the rise of guerrilla groups who responded with violence of their own? Historian Fernando Calderon and others have dubbed the debate over this the so-called two devils thesis. The idea, and you hear this a lot with conflicts in politics or history, is that both sides were kind of bad. Were the guerrillas and ruling PRI equally as bad, and the majority of Mexican people were caught in the middle between these two devils, or should one side bear more of the blame? I think it's fair to say that most historians in the modern day reject the two devils thesis, this idea that both sides are equally to blame, and most Mexican people were caught in the middle between two crazy factions. And it's fair to say that most historians place most of the blame for the Dirty War on the corruption and the violence and the state terror that the authoritarian PRI regime had been ruling with for decades after the Mexican Revolution. But either way, these are interesting questions that we're going to be thinking about more over the course of the series. Now, at any rate, the question of why people joined up with guerrilla movements is a separate but related one. We've discussed the role of economics, social unrest, and historical memory, but there is also some global context that may have played a role. And this is another area where there is some historical debate. Do guerrilla movements in Mexico form as more of a top-down, Cold War era communist spread of ideology type of thing? Or do they form more as a bottom-up, violent revolution taking place in the larger context of Mexican history? Historian Alexander Avina describes the flaw in the first approach. According to this view, radicalized utopian agitators from the Soviet Union or Cuba came to Mexico, stirred up the hapless masses, sparked guerrilla movements, which led to a violent and authoritarian crackdown. The problem is that this view takes away agency from ordinary people. It ignores the broader context of Mexican history and the economic situation that real people were living in. And it doesn't account for collective memory. Avina instead argues that violent revolution should be put in the context of broader global events, sure, but also the context of memory, personal violence, and social struggle. Now, that's not to say that communist ideology didn't have a role and that most of these guerrilla groups weren't learning Marx or Lenin or Guevara, because they often were, but there is nuance there that we will be delving into in a future episode. I think we should also note that the two student massacres in Mexico City, one in 1968 and the other in 1971, often get credit for radicalizing students and guerrilla groups, but as historians Adela Cedilla, Fernando Calderon, and others argue, guerrilla groups had already been forming and acting for all of the reasons that we mentioned in this episode. Although the student massacres get a lot of attention, and rightfully so, as they were horrifying, these massacres live in popular consciousness, but they were not the cause of the Dirty War. It's also worth noting that guerrilla movements never had the broad support of the Mexican public, much less the majority of the peasants or the working class. Violent tactics like kidnapping, bank robbing, and ambushes often did little to improve their standing in the eyes of ordinary Mexicans, particularly with the PRI and its access to mass media and propaganda weighing on the scales of public perception. So, given the obvious lack of success for guerrilla groups during the Dirty War, how should we view its ultimate legacy? Ultimately, like much of history, it's unclear. Some political reforms have been made in recent years. Archives to government documents have been declassified, giving historians access to the details of PRI state terror, and families of disappeared ones have hope at closure. But for most families, that closure has never come, and most of the families of the victims still don't know the fate of disappeared loved ones. The PRI lost the election of 2000, the first time since the Mexican Revolution that they lost, and a landmark in Mexican political history, but it remains unclear to what extent the issues that caused the Dirty War will be resolved in modern times, particularly as the cycle of history spins and a new Dirty War of sorts is waged between drug cartels and the Mexican government. One thing is clear about the legacy of the Dirty War, however. Just as collective consciousness and historical memory played a role in its causes, it will leave a devastating mark and a terrible human cost on the survivors and the family members of the victims. And it will be another historical element adding to the complex legacy of Mexican history that current and future generations will have to address.